September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. Along the Polish frontier, the dark still held the smell of wet soil, machine oil, and harvested grain. In villages not yet fully awake, dogs barked before church bells could ring. Then the first violence came in a language of steel. Engines bringing forward, boots striking mud, artillery splitting dawn open before sunrise had earned the sky. What began in that hour was not simply another border war. It was the breaking point of a continent that had been living for 20 years inside unfinished anger. The German invasion of Poland was the moment the long aftershock of the First World War became a second and far greater catastrophe. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Yet the shells falling over Poland had not been born that morning. They had been forming for a generation. In treaties, humiliations, economic collapse, imperial dreams, and the slow surrender of democratic confidence. Even there, in that first morning of motion and fire, another sound was already waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. The clean metallic click of a ration tin opening. A small future echo of a democracy that had not fully entered the war, but would one day feed, arm, and overwhelm entire continents. To understand why the world went to war again, one has to return to June 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles tried to impose peace on the ruins of Europe. The treaty created the League of Nations in the hope that law and diplomacy might prevent another slaughter, but it also forced Germany to surrender territory, disarm, and pay for the damage of war. To many in Britain and America, those terms already seemed vindictive. To millions in Germany, they felt like national humiliation turned into permanent policy. Defeat became not merely military, but psychological. A generation was taught to see itself as dishonored, encircled, diminished. In that bitterness, myths flourished. That Germany had not truly been beaten in the field, that politicians and civilians had betrayed the army, that the post-war order was not peace but punishment. The 1920s and 1930s then transformed resentment into opportunity. Calls to revise Versailles became central to international politics. The treaty had not only redrawn borders, it had left behind a wound, and wounds, when married to grievance and fear, become powerful political instruments. A peace settlement that was supposed to close one age of destruction instead preserved its emotional fuel. World War II did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from a failed peace that punished without reconciling, restrained without convincing, and left too many people prepared to believe that force alone could restore dignity, territory, and destiny. Then came the collapse of faith. The interwar years were marked by instability, and after 1929, the international economy itself began to fail. Political, economic, and social unrest deepened. In such conditions, democracy can appear patient, procedural, slow. Authoritarianism arrives with drumbeat certainty. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already come to power in 1922, offering discipline, spectacle, and national revival. In Germany, Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, and rapidly built a totalitarian one-party state. Political opposition was violently repressed. He exploited the popular belief that Germany had been humiliated after the First World War and promised economic recovery, national renewal, and a return to greatness through revision of Versailles. Germany withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. In 1935, Hitler announced rearmament and reintroduced conscription, openly violating the treaty. At the same time, in Asia, Imperial Japan pursued conquest with the support of its emperor, military establishment, and sections of its educated elite, seeking rule and influence across East Asia and the Pacific. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum describes Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan as unleashing war with the intention of establishing permanent dominance over Europe and Asia by military conquest. That is the deeper reason the war came. Not simply because armies crossed borders, but because entire regimes were built on the belief that hierarchy was natural, that empire was necessary, that force was cleansing, and that the post-World War I order deserved to be broken. The tragedy is that the warning signs were not hidden. They arrived one after another, public and unmistakable, and still the democratic powers hesitated. On October 3, 1935, Fascist Italy invaded Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia. The League of Nations intervened weakly, and Britain and France struggled to coordinate an effective response. Limited sanctions only pushed Italy closer to Germany. Encouraged by that failure, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland on March 7, 1936, violating the post-war settlement again. Britain didn't respond militarily. France, already insecure, did little. Then came intervention in the Spanish Civil War, which sharpened the divide between fascist and democratic Europe. In March 1938, German troops entered Austria, and the annexation met little international resistance. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, and Europe came to the brink of war. Munich, Britain, and France accepted German annexation of the Sudetenland in the hope that concession might preserve peace. Czechoslovakia was not invited to shape the terms of its own dismemberment. Appeasement was not cowardice alone. It was also exhaustion, unreadiness, anti-war feeling, imperial overextension, and the memory of the First World War still burning in public consciousness. To Hitler, every concession was not a compromise. It was evidence. It proved that will mattered more than law, speed more than principle, audacity more than restraint. By March 1939, when German forces occupied what remained of Czech territory, Britain and France finally understood that there were no natural limits to his ambitions. By then, the lesson had come late. The final crisis gathered around Poland. The city of Danzig and the Polish corridor had long symbolized German resentment over the post-1918 settlement. Britain and France, recognizing Poland as the likely next target, guaranteed Polish independence in March 1939. Yet diplomacy continued to decay. Talks between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union failed. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, along with a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Hitler was now free to strike Poland without fear of immediate Soviet war. On September 1, German forces launched the invasion at 4:45 a.m. with blitzkrieg, lightning war, intended to disorient, encircle, and destroy before a slower enemy could react. Britain still hoped for a peaceful solution in the final days, but once the ultimatum expired without German withdrawal, Neville Chamberlain announced to Britain at 11:15 a.m. on September 3rd, "This country is at war with Germany." That sentence sounded restrained, almost sorrowful, but it marked the failure of 2 decades of attempted order. The Second World War began in Europe because revisionist dictatorship had concluded that the democracies were divided, because appeasement had been read as weakness, because the post-1919 settlement had left behind grievance without stability, and because the international system lacked the force to stop aggressors before aggression became a method of rule. For many German soldiers, the war did not at first feel like dissent. It felt like vindication. They marched through the opening campaigns under banners of restored pride into a Europe where Germany seemed finally to be undoing Versailles by force. The early rhythm of victory, Poland, then Western Europe, appeared to confirm what Nazi ideology had promised, that parliamentary states were weak, that speed and hardness would always defeat hesitation, that history belonged to the ruthless. Many expected a short war, a decisive war, a war that would restore empire and then settle into a new continental order under German dominance. They had been taught to despise democracy as decadent and to see abundance itself as a sign of softness. But ideology is strongest before logistics begin to fail. In the first triumphs, what they saw was movement, applause, captured cities, and maps changing color. What they did not yet see was how wars built on racial conquest and perpetual extension consume their own premises. A war launched to secure living space would require ever more land, ever more labor, ever more fuel, ever more death. The quick victory they imagined depended on the enemy remaining paralyzed. Once enemies adapted, the structure beneath the myth would show itself. Coercion instead of stability, plunder instead of economy, terror instead of legitimacy. The soldier marching beneath the illusion of invincibility could not yet know that the same war that promised national resurrection would end in burned cities, shattered armies, and a moral ruin deeper than military defeat. Japanese soldiers entered the widening war with a parallel expectation. Imperial Japan sought not a defensive settlement, but a sphere of domination across East Asia and the Pacific. The war in Asia had roots before 1939, but in the global conflict, its ambitions hardened into a bid for regional supremacy. The Japanese military establishment and many in the educated elite supported a program of expansion that promised resources, strategic depth, and imperial destiny. The early victories that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor seemed for a moment to validate the gamble. On December 8, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress with words the National Archives preserves in his revised draft. December 7, 1941, would be a date which will live in infamy. For Japan, Pearl Harbor was meant to disable American intervention and create time to consolidate conquest. For the United States, it destroyed hesitation. What Japanese planners hoped would intimidate instead unified. What was intended as a strategic shock became a moral awakening. Japanese soldiers, like German soldiers earlier, were conditioned to see their enemies as divided, comfort-loving, and unprepared for sacrifice. They expected collapse of will before collapse of materiel. Instead, they had struck a society that, once mobilized, could convert outrage into production on a scale few dictatorships fully grasped. Here, the war's emotional contrast sharpened. The Axis expected softness and met resolve. They expected short campaigns and awakened industrial civilizations. At that point, the conflict became unmistakably global. Nazi Germany sought empire in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Imperial Japan pursued rule across East Asia and the Pacific. Fascist Italy chased prestige and territory. The Axis partnership, as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes, was rooted in anti-communism and dissatisfaction with the post-World War I order. Yet those shared resentments could win alliances faster than they could build a durable world. The war spread across Europe, North Africa, the Soviet Union, the Atlantic, and the Pacific, until it became the most destructive conflict in human history. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 shattered the non-aggression pact and expanded the war again. Pearl Harbor pulled the United States directly into both theaters. From that moment, the balance began slowly to change, not all at once on the battlefield, but in the deeper arithmetic of endurance. Roosevelt had already framed the American role in December 1940 when he called the United States the arsenal of democracy. It was one of the defining phrases of the war, not because it was poetic, but because it understood the coming struggle. The Axis had built systems of command, fear, and conquest. The democracies, once awakened, would answer not only with armies, but with shipyards, rail lines, foundries, voting publics, tax rolls, volunteers, and assembly lines. The war was no longer a contest of boldness alone. It was becoming a contest between systems, coercive empires that glorified scarcity and obedient sacrifice, and an industrial democracy capable of turning civilian life into organized power without surrendering the language of citizenship. That is where the small metal can enters the story, not as a trivial object, but as a symbol. In January 1942, only weeks after the Japanese attacks in the Pacific, the U.S. government mandated rationing. Goods were limited, materials redirected, consumption disciplined. The Office of Price Administration and the War Production Board oversaw a nation learning how to deny itself in order to supply its armies. There were certificate systems, coupon systems, point systems. Shoes, sugar, coffee, gasoline, meat, canned goods. Ordinary life was measured, counted, and reallocated. Tin, steel, copper, aluminum, nickel. These could no longer flow freely into civilian comfort. The National Park Service notes that in 1941, American factories had made more articles for civilian use than ever before. And then, the government ordered production cuts to strip off some of that fat. Aluminum pots gave way to enamelware. Toys became wood and cardboard. Clothes were mended, remade, conserved. Yet, this sacrifice did not contradict abundance. It organized a society rich enough to ration would also be a society rich enough to redirect. In January 1942, Roosevelt created the War Production Board to turn peacetime factories toward war. In 1941, the United States had manufactured about 3 million automobiles. During the entire war, only 139 additional civilian cars rolled off assembly lines. The lines that once produced consumer ease began producing guns, trucks, tanks, aircraft engines, ships, and the sealed little containers of sustenance that would follow soldiers across oceans. By war's end, according to the Department of War, half of the world's wartime industrial production was in the United States. The can on the mess line, the can in the pack, the can opened in rain or snow, that was not just food. It was policy made edible. It was democracy industrialized. The American field ration distilled that transformation into something a soldier could carry in one hand. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum records that the K-ration was designed as an individual, easy-to-carry ration for assault and combat operations, noted for compactness, packaging, and nutritional balance. The first million K-rations were ordered in May 1942. In 1944, more than 105 million were procured. That number matters because it reveals the scale at which democracy could turn ordinary manufacturing discipline into military stamina. Somewhere in Europe or the Pacific, the metallic crack of a ration box opening could sound almost rudely modest beside artillery and engines. But for exhausted troops, it meant calories, predictability, and continuity. And for German and Japanese soldiers, often operating under increasing strain as the war lengthened, the encounter with American power was not always first felt through grand strategy. Sometimes it arrived through repetition, more trucks than expected, more shells than expected, more planes returning, more ships offshore, more packaged food, more evidence that the enemy they had been taught to dismiss possessed not only wealth, but organized wealth. The dictatorships had promised that democracies were too fractured, too comfortable, too individualistic to sustain a total war. Yet the very society mocked for consumer abundance proved capable of converting that abundance into disciplined output. The ration tin became a rebuke to authoritarian certainty. It said that a free society could count, plan, distribute, and endure. This was the emotional reversal at the heart of the war. German soldiers had expected a brief campaign of domination, and instead found themselves in a struggle measured by winters, ruined cities, collapsing supply lines, and enemies who would not vanish. Japanese soldiers had expected decisive intimidation, and instead faced a foe that answered loss with multiplication. The contrast was not merely military, it was ideological. Fascism promised clarity, unity, and destiny. It claimed that liberal societies were weak because they argued, voted, hesitated, and valued private life. But once the war widened, the democracies showed another kind of power, the capacity to persuade citizens to sacrifice, to redirect industry through public legitimacy, to call women into factories, volunteers into ration boards, workers into shipyards, and entire populations into a long war effort without requiring a single, all-explaining doctrine of blood and obedience. This is why the reasons for World War II cannot be reduced to one treaty, or one invasion, or one leader alone. The war began because grievances found dictators, because economic crisis hollowed faith in constitutional politics, because imperial ambitions clothed themselves in racial mission, because the League of Nations failed to deter early aggression, because appeasement bought time but also fed expansion, and because too many people believed that force could revise history without exploding it. Yet the war was also decided by a reversal in belief. The Axis believed democracy would be brittle. Instead, it proved cumulative. Each rationed kitchen, each converted factory, each convoy, each ballot-backed government decision added weight to the side the dictators had called weak. Seen in that light, the reason of World War II is not singular, but layered, like sediment under pressure until an earthquake breaks through. There was the immediate reason. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. There was the political reason. Britain and France, after years of concession, finally judged that further retreat would mean surrendering the balance of power in Europe. There was the ideological reason. Nazism and Japanese militarism sought permanent regional domination through conquest. There was the structural reason. The post-World War I order left behind unresolved resentment, weak collective security, and states willing to gamble that treaties could be broken faster than alliances could respond. There was the economic reason. The collapse of 1929 radicalized societies and discredited moderation. There was the psychological reason. Millions of people, wounded by defeat, unemployment, inflation, or fear of social collapse, became willing to exchange liberty for certainty. And there was the moral reason. Regimes built on racial hierarchy, political violence, and expansion cannot remain still. Their internal logic demands enemies, territory, purification, movement. Peace becomes intolerable to systems that justify themselves through struggle. This is why every concession in the 1930s felt temporary. The engines of aggression were not malfunctioning. They were working exactly as designed. The invasion of Poland was the explosion, but the charge had been laid by years of humiliation, revisionism, ideological extremism, and failed deterrence. And then the cost arrived, until the causes were almost swallowed by the consequences. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that the war expanded across continents and resulted in an estimated 55 million deaths. That figure is so large it resists comprehension. It contains cities burned from the air, villages erased, prisoners marched, civilians starved, soldiers frozen, families scattered, and a whole populations targeted for annihilation under racial policy. The same war that some entered in the language of revival ended in industrialized death. The same Europe that had promised never again after 1918 produced new killing fields within a generation. And still that little can remains in the frame. Not because canned food can redeem the war, nothing can, but because symbols matter in history. The ration tin links front line to home front, worker to soldier, voter to state, sacrifice to supply. It reminds us that abundance in a democracy is not mere comfort. Under threat, it can become endurance shared at scale. Americans gave up metal, fuel, fabric, sugar, coffee, and convenience so that ships could sail and armies could eat. Out of those restrictions came an astonishing paradox. A nation that curtailed civilian excess became at the same time the greatest reservoir of wartime production on Earth. To Axis soldiers taught that democracy meant weakness, the recurring evidence of American supply, food, fuel, trucks, artillery, aircraft, replacements, became a lesson written not in theory, but in repetition. The enemy did not run out. So when we ask why World War II happened, we're really asking how a civilization lost faith in restraint and how aggressive states learned to turn grievance into
destiny.
We are asking why the wounds of one war were left to ferment into the next, why institutions built to preserve peace could not enforce it, why publics exhausted by memory accepted illusions of strength, and why leaders who promised order through domination were believed until domination produced only larger chaos. But history offers another answer as well, one discovered not in conferences or manifestos, but in experience. German and Japanese soldiers expected democracies to be decadent and found them relentless. They expected division and found coordination. They expected softness and heard over and over the hard little click of mass production arriving at the front in the shape of food, ammunition, engines, and steel. Roosevelt's phrase, arsenal of democracy, endured because it named more than factories. It named a political truth, that free societies, though slower to awaken, can summon depths of loyalty, labor, and sacrifice that tyrannies routinely mistake for weakness. In the end, the dawn over Poland in 1939 and the ration tin opened years later on distant fronts belong to the same story. One marked the collapse of peace. The other marked the answer to that collapse. The war began in humiliation, ambition, appeasement, and conquest. It widened through ideology and miscalculation. It consumed millions because regimes built on force believed history could be bullied into obedience. Yet, the larger truth it revealed was not only about destruction. It was about the kind of power that endures. Freedom is noisy. It argues, it rations and votes, delays and doubts. It does not always move with the terrible speed of dictatorship. But when it understands what is at stake, it can turn fields, foundries, kitchens, shipyards, and ordinary households into a force vast enough to outlast empires of fear. That is why the reasons for World War II matter still. They warn us how bitterness becomes doctrine, and how doctrine becomes war. And they remind us that against the glamour of authoritarian certainty, there was another sound, more humble and more lasting. The small metallic opening of sustenance shared. The proof that abundance joined to liberty can become resistance, and that the free world, once fully stirred, is hardest to defeat when it remembers that its strength begins in the common things it is willing to preserve for one another.